Good evening. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to Lakeside Church of Christ. Perhaps you might be visiting with us tonight. If you are, always consider yourself our guest. Let us get to know you before you take off. We'll try to keep our distance, but still find out a little bit about you. And if you would at this time, if we could also maybe silence our cell phones at this time, or any other device we might have that might disturb us. A few announcements we have here. Monday night for the Masters. Met last Monday. It'll be meeting again on the 28th at 7 p.m. We'll have a short Devo, and then we'll followed by our projects. If you haven't gone to that or don't know what that's about, that's a work that we do here. I would encourage you. There's usually something for everyone, but kind of low right now because we're not getting out and visiting and some things like that, but there's still stuff to do. So if you want to join that, that's great. That's the 28th Monday week. It's 7 p.m. Next Wednesday, the 30th, is the 5th Wednesday of the month. All classes will meet in the auditorium. If you have any questions, you can talk to Mr. Peter Esdale. He has all the answers. Don't forget our Lakeside Fall Gospel Meeting is going to be held between October the 23rd through the 25th. The theme is Dangers of a Cell Phone with guest speakers Jonathan Zerpolo. We hope you can attend us. If not, you can watch live stream, but we'd much rather have you here. And just a couple of reminders. Encourage the use of face masks. Communion packets are available. Fellowship Hall, Monday through Thursday, 10 to 2. Any other stuff like that, pretty much the same announcements we've been making since, March. That's been a long time. I believe that is all I have. We will hopefully have a song leader up here to start, and we will begin our evening service.
Steve, I didn't grab the clicker. Will you do it? All right. Good deal. Good evening. Our first song tonight will be Here I Am to Worship. Light of the world, you step down into darkness. Open my eyes.
You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Sodium is in a lot of things we eat. It goes from the basics like chips, French fries, and meats to things some people wouldn't even consider like cheese, breads, and some fruits and vegetables. Sodium is the 6th most abundant element on earth. Salt is everywhere and used in many things. Likewise, as Jesus said, we are to be salt. We are to be everywhere and throughout everything, going throughout the world, convincing those to turn to Jesus, as Matthew 28:19-20 and Deuteronomy 6:7 say. Just as salt is abundant, we must be abundant. But we cannot lose our flavor or passion for Christ. Because what good is unflavored salt? If we got salt that has no flavor, our first instinct would probably be to throw it away. If people throw us and what we're trying to say away, how will we get the message out into the world? The answer is we can't. If you have yet to be a Christian, we can help with that. If you're ready to take on the Lord in baptism and repent of your sins, he will make you clean. Or maybe you've already become a Christian and you've just lost your flavor. You've lost your passion for Christ. We can help with that too. Whatever your need may be, please come forward as we stand and sing.
Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for all your blessings that you've blessed us with tonight. Thank you for this opportunity we have to gather together and to learn more about your word. Thank you for all the strengthening souls we have here tonight, that we can all benefit one another, encourage each other, and teach each other more about you. Please help us tonight as we depart, that we may help bring your word to others and to be a grand influence on those around us. And please let us all depart safely as well, and let us learn as much as we can from this lesson tonight. your Son's name we pray, amen.
Can you hear me up back there in the back? Not yet? Okay. Hope you have your Bibles, and let's go ahead and turn to the end of 1 Samuel 15. We left off talking about Saul's disobedience in connection with the Amalekites last week, and we will continue thinking about Saul's decline as well as David's ascension into prominence and into popularity, and so I'm looking forward to that discussion tonight. Let's have our quiz. Are you ready? Hope you can remember. I see a lot of looks of assurance and confidence, and that's good. Name an act of disobedience committed by Saul which led to the kingdom being taken from him. An unlawful sacrifice. That's right. Does anybody want to name another one? Right. He didn't exterminate the Amalekites. That's right. Very good. Those are the two big ones that we have considered so far. And then he also, although this is not as pronounced, but he also made a rash vow or a rash promise that anybody who ate prior to the defeat of the Philistines would be killed. And that turned out to be Jonathan, you remember. And the people protested, although Saul was ready to kill Jonathan. If you promise to commit sin, what should you do? Should you keep your promise or break your promise? You should break your promise. Even though it's important to keep promises, you should not add sin to your list of wrongdoing, another sin to your list of wrongdoings. Go ahead and break your promise. Number two, another way to say that is it's always wrong to sin. Even if you promise to do it, it's still wrong to commit the sin, isn't it? Okay, number two, true or false? Saul was a Levite. False. And that's really why what John said a minute ago applied, is that he wasn't in the position to be offering a sacrifice. But then we also said last week that there was possibly another thing wrong with what Saul was doing, not just the fact that he was offering sacrifice as a non-Levite, but also what? He may not have waited for Samuel as long as Samuel had told him to. I have a hard time thinking Samuel said, "I'll be there," and then he didn't show up. It seems more likely to me that Saul just got in a hurry because the people seemed to be deserting him. Number three, name the king whom Saul spared after defeating the Amalekites. Agag. Very good. Number four, well, I just answered this a moment ago. Jonathan violated Saul's rash command. You got that one easy. Last one, fill in the blank, no peeking. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. And that's a good lesson for people to hear today, that just because you sincerely feel that you ought to do something in religion, that doesn't mean that it's obedience. What does God really want? He wants sincere obedience, not just sincere action. He doesn't want somebody to just do any old thing out of sincerity. And remember, at the beginning of Romans 10, Paul says that Israel's problem was not sincerity. Remember, Israel, after Christ had been raised, after the church had been established, and the Jewish people were generally unresponsive to the gospel, he said that they were zealous, they had a zeal for God, they were sincere, but what was the problem? It wasn't according to knowledge. Therefore, it wasn't obedience. So sincerity alone will not save anybody. We must not say, oh, well, this action is justified before God because it is sincerely believed in somebody's heart. A lot of people sincerely believe all kinds of things. Or this person's got to be right before God because what he's doing is heartfelt. Heartfelt is fine, and we need to be heartfelt, but we need to be heartfelt according to the truth, don't we? And that was Saul's problem. At least here Samuel says, to obey is better than to sacrifice. You really felt like you needed to make a sacrifice, but really what you need to do is obey. And that'll involve the right kinds of sacrifices at the appropriate times. Okay, I'll show this slide every week because this is a reminder that we're covering these three kings who reigned at specific places for a certain amount of time. And I want you to make sure you have the passages in front of you that will give you the times when they reigned and their locations and so forth. So you will have this on the slides if you want to get those. Remember, just give me your email address and you'll have all the slides for the class. 1 Samuel 16 through 20 is our text for tonight. And next week, or next time we get together, next week is prayer service because it's the 5th Wednesday. But the next time we have this class is October 7th, and we really get to study David as a fugitive, as he flees from Saul. And that's the nature of your handout. I gave you a handout that gives you a list of places where David was in chapters 19 through 27, and then it's keyed to a map that's on the back. So if that's helpful just to see. And the big lesson from this, the big picture lesson, is that he was all over the place, wasn't he? He was all over the map because he just couldn't get away from Saul. And we'll see exactly how devastating that was as we read the text in the next few weeks. I wanted to say a few words about the Amalekites, the people Saul was fighting, because Brother George brought up a very important question at the end of class, and I was not able to answer it on the spur of the moment. I'm sorry about that, but we wanted to talk about what was God's perspective of the Amalekites in particular. Were they one of those tribes whom God had commanded be driven out of the land, or were they extraneous to the land, or what was the precise perspective of the people toward this nation? So a little bit about the Amalekites, and then we'll get back to our text because this is a relevant question. We don't know exactly where the Amalekites originated. Some people think that there were two Amalekite people because they are listed as a people back in the days of Jacob and Esau, but it seems to me that that's referencing the land. I mean, they're referenced as occupying the land where Jacob and Esau were, not necessarily that they existed at that time, but they would later occupy that land. So we can talk about that another time if you want. But the big event in the Old Testament with the Amalekites was in Exodus 17 at Rephidim. And you remember we talked about this the other night in our sermon about Aaron, where Aaron and Hur held up Moses' hands at the battle. And the Amalekites were the people who were attacking Israel on that occasion, and they did it unprovoked. Israel was just sort of passing through, and the Amalekites jumped out and attacked them and nearly beat them because Moses' hands started to weaken. And the Israelites were to destroy the Amalekites. We read about that later in Deuteronomy 25. The interesting thing about it is they're told to defeat the Amalekites after God gave them the land. So the implication is they were to take their territory, but since the Amalekites were a little bit to the south of the territory they would take, that they weren't obligated to wipe them out or drive them out until they had already taken the land that God had given them. The Amalekites are present in southern Canaan at the time of the conquest. They're reported as being there by the spies, and we read about them being there in Judges 12:15. Israel ignored Moses' warnings. Remember, Moses said, Okay, you didn't have enough faith to take the promised land, so we're going to wander around in the wilderness for 40 years, and this generation is going to die. The only people who are going to get to go in from this generation are Joshua and Caleb. And some of the Israelites said, no, we're going to try to take the land now anyway. Maybe they felt guilty. Maybe they realized the consequence of their action, but they ignored Moses and tried to break in anyway. And guess who met them? The Amalekites were some of the people. The Amalekites helped Eglon in Judges 3:13. Gideon defeated the Amalekites and the Midianites. And so what I'm trying to say to you is they were continually present during this time. So I take it that what's happening now in 1 Samuel 15 is that God is saying to Saul, it's now time. I told you back in Deuteronomy 25, do not forget. In fact, it specifically tells, Moses specifically instructed the Israelites, do not forget to take care of the Amalekites. After you've gotten into your land, go get them. But they had been lax about that, apparently. So God says in 1 Samuel 15, wipe them out. And did Saul do that? We may tend to think that Saul wiped them all out except for the king. I don't think he did. I think he was exaggerating when he said that he had wiped them all out, because David fights against them later. I mean, think about it. If Saul killed them all except for Agag and the best of their possessions, and then Samuel hacked Agag to pieces, they're all gone, aren't they? They're not all gone. Somehow Saul was wrong. Maybe Saul meant we defeated all their soldiers, but they continued to cause Israel problems after that. In the days of David and even in Hezekiah's day, the Simeonites attacked a remnant of the Amalekites. Now, what does that show you? That if you don't take care of business the way God says to, you're going to have problems later. And isn't that the way the church ought to think of things even today? That if we say, for example, well, we don't need to be too serious about our Sunday school program because they're just little children, and it doesn't really matter what they're taught. You know, I was at one congregation one time where I just happened to observe. This was far away from here, but I just happened to observe one of the kids coming out from Sunday school class with Winnie the Pooh on the sheet of paper. And I thought to myself, well, you know, maybe the kid just took Winnie the Pooh in there with him and then came out with Winnie. But that's what they were giving the kids. And there's nothing sinful about Winnie the Pooh. I'm not saying that, but it caused me to think, are they really serious about teaching their children the things of God? Can't they get Winnie the Pooh all through the week? Don't they need to get something scriptural on Sunday? Don't you think so? But somebody who was in charge of that class was thinking, well, it's just little kids. I mean, they don't really learn much anyway. Anybody who's had little kids knows that they do learn things. And they need to be learning the Bible as much as possible. And if they're not learning it during the 2 half-hour segments or 45-minute segments they have at church, when are they going to learn it? Hopefully they're learning it at home. But that's just an example. Or what if we say, well, you know, the qualifications of elders are more like general guidelines. And so if we have a person who we think is really a nice person, and he doesn't quite meet all the qualifications, like the family qualifications, you know, he's smart with money. He's a good businessman. Everybody likes hanging out with him. Well, let's just go ahead and make him an elder. Are we going to have problems later if we ignore qualifications? Or, you know, just go on down, think of things like, oh, we're dating someone, and we think, I see that there are some spiritual problems. And I know that this person doesn't really want to go to all the services of the church with me, but she's such a good person, and she's so pretty. And I love being with her. I just feel like I've got to. Are there going to be problems spiritually if there's a lack of commitment now? What's going to happen? How are we going to train our children down the line? You just see examples, and you can think of your own. But here the Israelites skirted the issue about the Amalekites, and Saul exaggerated how well he had done it, and it caused the Israelites problems later. Okay. George, anything you want to add on that? Okay. Well, that's what should happen when we have a question like that. Okay. Saul unlawfully offered sacrifice, made a rash vow, and disobeyed God's commands. That's the first part of what he did. We're going to see more as we go along. David is going to be anointed king. Let's read the end of chapter 15, verse 34. Then Samuel went to Ramah, but Saul went up to his house at Gibeah at Saul. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, for Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So the table has turned. God favored Saul, but now he disfavors him because of his disobedience. And this made Samuel very distraught. Let's read in chapter 16, just at the beginning of the chapter. Now the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse, the Bethlehemite, for I have selected a king for myself among his sons." But Samuel said, "How can I go? When Saul hears of it, he will kill me." That shows Saul's attitude. Samuel perceives that jealousy, what is unrighteous jealousy or envy. We always have to be careful about those terms, because God is jealous with a righteous jealousy, and there's also the sin of envy. And incidentally, the King James Version is helpful on this, because it, as far as I know, it always translates the righteous quality as jealousy and the sinful quality as envy, even though we use those words interchangeably. So here, Samuel is recognizing that Saul has an unrighteous jealousy or an envy, so much that he would kill Samuel if he even went to anoint somebody. And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord," so that he can be telling Saul the truth, even if he's not telling Saul everything he knows. And incidentally, that shows you can be truthful without always telling everything you know. That's a very prudent position for us to take, so that we can not hurt people's feelings sometimes and still be honest. We mustn't lie. We mustn't intend to deceive people, but we can tell the truth and not tell everything we know. Otherwise, we would just needlessly cause division. "You shall invite Jesse," verse 3 says, "to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me the one whom I designate to you." So Samuel did what the Lord said and came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the city came trembling to meet him and said, "Do you come in peace?" He said, "In peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." He also consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they entered, he looked at Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him," that is, before God. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Isn't that an important verse? There are so many times when we might judge someone based on some superficialities, when God judges based on their character. And there are many ways in which we might do this. James 2 discusses a scenario where we might judge somebody's worth based on their money. And we show deference to a person, personal favoritism, James calls it, based on somebody's riches. And we mistreat somebody because he has lesser wealth. Galatians 2 talks about a circumstance where Peter mistreated Gentile brethren, didn't want to sit with them, when some Jewish brethren sent from James came to Antioch. And so that was a problem where he showed personal favoritism based upon some superficiality. And here, Samuel's not sinning. He just more or less supposes that this big, strong, oldest child is probably the one. He's here at this family's house, and this is the best-looking one, so he says, this is probably it. But God says, I may be picking someone you would not suspect. Okay, Mr. Eric? Well, the consecration for a sacrifice goes back to when the Israelites were first establishing the priesthood, and anybody who came into the temple area or the tabernacle area initially had to be washed, and you couldn't come dirty before the Lord, and particularly the priests had to go through a washing. And you can read about that in Exodus chapter 29 and other passages. Right. Yeah, you had to wash up. That's right. Yes, sir. Right. 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 George is talking about the washing, the baths, more or less, that archaeologists have found around the temple, and some of them are still there. You can go see them. And I was just, ironically, my mom's here tonight, and we were just talking about this because she went to Jerusalem a couple of years ago, and she was talking about how if you really go to the temple, just like George is saying, and George has been over there too, I suppose, if you go over there, you look around and you see all the opportunities for people to wash. This objection to Acts 2 that they could not have possibly baptized 3,000 people just melts away, because it would have been perfectly easy for 12 guys to baptize 3,000 people in a few hours at that place. Furthermore, once you've baptized somebody, he might well want to go and become one of the baptizers. And then you've got more people doing baptizing and plenty of places for them to do it. So don't ever let anybody tell you that Acts 2 can't be accurate, because there'd be no way for people to do the baptizing that fast. It certainly could have been done. Good point. So there's just part of this consecration that was operative in Judaism. All right, now, man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, another one of the sons. And he said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. And then Shammah comes in verse 9, and Jesse made, verse 10 says, 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. And Samuel said to Jesse, are these all the children? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, and behold, he is tending the sheep. Then Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here. And God is anointed, David is anointed by Samuel, and the Spirit of God comes upon Samuel from that day forward. And so Samuel is aware now of his future as the king. Then, later in chapter 16, a distressing spirit, or some translations say an evil spirit from the Lord, comes upon Saul. And this prompts him to be connected with David as a harpist, somebody who can soothe him. Some people will say that this was some kind of a demon, or that God somehow afflicted Saul in a supernatural way, and I wouldn't question the degree to which God might have been involved in this. I wouldn't want to restrict God, but I do know from the text that whatever this was, it was something that harp music could solve. And so that would seem to be something that's more like some type of depression, or something that is natural, or at least occurring naturally without a miracle, without divine intervention, that could well happen today. But this might also simply be, here's how to phrase it. If I say it's a natural thing, then somebody's going to say, well, in what sense is it from the Lord? Doesn't the Lord allow us to suffer the consequences psychologically of our own sin? And that is from the Lord, because God gave us our conscience, which can be afflicted by the wrong attitudes that we take. If I'm hateful toward my neighbor, how do I feel all day when I'm going around the house thinking bad thoughts about my neighbor? Am I going to be happy and cheerful? I'm going to have a distressing spirit. And the word translated spirit doesn't necessarily refer to a supernatural being. It can be just an attitude, in the same way that you might observe that someone is down, and you might say, well, his spirits seem kind of down today. That may be the type of thing that we're referring to with Saul. Did I see a hand? Yes, sir.
In the realm of conjecture, okay, where do you think Saul, being sort of one of the main players, the Jews at that time, was God pleased with him enough to allow him into heaven? Or did he do that?
Well, the Bible doesn't pronounce Saul's judgment, and I'm not the judge, but it's not favorable for Saul, is it? Because how does he die? Does he die in a moment of repentance and saying, I sure am sorry? As the Philistines are rushing on to him, is he praying to God for forgiveness? And no, he's committing suicide. So it's very difficult for me to imagine a scenario in which Saul is in heaven. I wish it were not so. And then David, instead of Saul, And isn't this ironic? David, instead of Saul, slays Goliath in chapter 17. David is incensed that a Philistine would be mocking the armies of God when David has confidence that God will deliver the Israelites. For David, it's a very simple equation, isn't it? If the people put their trust in God, then God delivers. If people show that they have confidence in God and go into battle believing in God and in obedience to God, then they win. So David says, I'll just go and defeat Goliath with God's help. Not because I'm some mighty warrior, but because God has helped me. And he looked back at the past and he saw how God had helped him defeat a lion and defeat a bear to protect his sheep as he functioned as a shepherd. And he thought, Goliath is really no different. This is some creature that's more powerful than I am, and yet God can help me to defeat him. And so he picks up the 5 smooth stones from Elah and from the brook there and in the valley of Elah and shoots one up that sinks into Goliath's forehead. I've always wondered what that might have been like, and did God do something miraculous to help that to sink down into his forehead? That's a mighty good slingshot, isn't it? When I was a kid, I wanted to have a slingshot just so that I could try to be as accurate as David was, but that was not going to happen. Here is the place where this occurred, and you can go and see that. In fact, in the picture, you can't really see it too well on the screen, but there are cars parked down there because this is a tourist attraction, as you well imagine. But you can go to the brook and pick out your own 5 stones if you want to, and that would be a treasure. Now, Israel is going to drive out the Philistines as a result of this battle, and here you can see where the initial conflict occurs at Elah, and then how they drive them to Gath and then to Ekron. Notice that they drive them pretty deeply into Philistine territory. It's not as though they get them just barely into Philistine territory and say, now don't you come back anymore. They push them and push them and push them. It's as though David, in leading this assault, is attempting to send a real message, not just by defeating Goliath, but then desecrating his body by chopping his head off with his own sword, and then pushing the people as far as they can into that territory. This was a mighty victory. And wasn't this God's way? I'm reading between the lines here, but don't you suppose this was God's way of signaling his favor with David and his disfavor with Saul? That Saul the king was too afraid with all his armor and all the protection of the people to go and fight Goliath. But here comes this little shepherd boy who doesn't even take any armor. And he doesn't even take a sword. He takes a little slingshot and defeats the champion of the Philistines. That's just astonishing. But that just shows that the whole matter was God was with David and he wasn't with Saul anymore. And the people recognize this as they instantly begin to sing that David has slain his 10,000s and Saul has slain his thousands. Yes, sir.
I wonder about Saul's confidence even as a leader to have this teenage boy and him just kind of be like, sure. Of all the people, you're not even one of the soldiers. Of all the people to go against him, even though David's the only one that offered, you still gotta, as a leader, you gotta think to yourself, naturally I would be thinking, no, I'm not gonna send this little runt kid into battle. But I mean, so this is, at some point you would think in his own mind he would say, well, I can't send this kid. It's going to have to be me. And he never gets to that point.
Right. It's a lot that we don't know about this account. And I would not want to say that David necessarily looked like a runt. I don't know, because shortly, we have to remember, and God is with him, of course. We just don't know exactly what it looked like. But shortly, he's going to be the general. Saul is going to exalt him over the army, and I don't think he looked like one of our children downstairs. I think he was a strong guy, and shortly he is going to be a great warrior. But he was the youngest, and he was the one who stayed home, and he wasn't employed in the military right then. So I take your point that we're not dealing with someone who was considered a mighty warrior. That's for sure. Yes, sir.
I have a question. This is suggesting that David was actually
Right.
And I never realized that.
It's true.
He was king even when he fought the Philistines.
He was in line to be the king, right?
I mean, he was anointed.
Right, he was, right. Yes, sir.
There is conjecture as to why David picked up 5.
Right. Maybe he thought he might need some more, huh?
Goliath had 4 brothers.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I hadn't thought about that before. Okay, so maybe he thought he might have to have 1 stone for each brother, huh? Well, I never had thought about that before. Okay, we do have to move on for sake of time, but those are all very good comments. So let's jump to the first part of chapter 18, 1 Samuel 18. And I know we're going quickly, but the whole idea is to take just a few weeks and get an overview of the United Monarchy and let you study it for yourself in detail. Now, it came about, chapter 18, verse 1, when he had finished speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. Wouldn't that be an indication that Jonathan recognized David's status as being anointed? So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered. And Saul set him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So here is David's new position. Saul hates David, but Jonathan loves him. And that's going to figure very prominently in the coming chapters. Saul is going to cook up a scheme to have David killed by the Philistines because Saul sees David's popularity. Saul doesn't think he can just kill David outright, but he tries to kill him in private, not in public. He's going to try 3 times to kill him. 4, I guess, depending on how you count these marriages and attempted marriages. He tries to get him to marry Merab in order to get him to go out and fight the Philistines. And, well, let's just read it together. Let's read verse 17. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be a valiant man for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "My hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." So he marries my daughter. He's going to be even more indebted to me. And in return for the daughter, I'm going to be able to, at will, send him out into battle. But David said to Saul, "Who am I? And what is my life or my father's family in Israel that I should be the king's son-in-law?" So it came about at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Maholathite, for a wife. So Saul is trying to think of any way he can, whether in private or whether in battle, to get David killed. But that's not going to work. So he's going to try to give him the other daughter, Michal. Let's read beginning in verse 20. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. When they told Saul the thing was agreeable to him, Saul thought, "I will give her to him, that she may become a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines might be against him." Therefore Saul said to David, "For a second time you may be my son-in-law today." Then Saul commanded his servants, "Speak to David secretly, saying, Behold, the king delights in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law." Boy, that's treacherous, isn't it? So Saul's servants spoke these words to David. But David said, "Is it trivial in your sight to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and lightly esteemed?" This is just like Saul's humility at the beginning of his reign. The problem was Saul lost his humility and David never did. David made mistakes, but he always kept his humility before God. Okay, let's see. Verse 24. The servants of Saul reported to him according to these words which David spoke. Saul then said, "Thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry except 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies." That's a tall order. Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. When his servants told David these words, it pleased David to become the king's son-in-law. Before the days had expired, David rose up and went, he and his men, and struck down 200 men among the Philistines. So he asked for 100. David doubled it. Then David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. So Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, for a wife. When Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Saul's daughter loved him, then Saul was even more afraid of David. Thus Saul was David's enemy continually. Then the commanders of the Philistines went out to battle, and it happened as often as they went out that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul. So his name was highly esteemed. So Saul has plots where he's thrown a spear now at David to try to kill him, and he's had a plot to get him killed by the Philistines. And now, at the beginning of chapter 19, Saul is just going to begin to tell his servants to kill David whenever they have a chance to do it. But Saul is going to have to deal with his son. See, because Jonathan doesn't want to let this happen. So he's going to make an appeal to him. And then Saul, we're going to read it again in chapter 19, is going to cast his spear at David again, and then just begin to chase David wherever he can get him. So it's a rage, and it is a distressing spirit. It's great jealousy, and Saul wants the kingship to remain in his house, but God has other plans. So what do you observe about Saul, or what comments do you want to make about his attitude toward David, or about his actions, or anything in chapters 17 and 18?
It seems to me that throughout this scenario, God is more than evidently in control. He's not going to allow things to go some other way that he doesn't wish it.
Right. That's certainly true. God's watching over David, isn't he? Yes, sir.
He just turned from God completely. Samuel's going, he didn't inquire God for any guidance or judgment or forgiveness. He just is totally set himself up virtually as the God on earth. Do what he wants to, ignore the God of heaven, and preserve his power.
He can still be, the comment was, Saul's turned away from God completely. He vacillates. And so while it certainly is true that he doesn't seem to be concerned for God's will, he is capable of being reached by his son. Look at chapter 19 and verse 6. Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul vowed, "As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death." Then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these words. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as formerly. So he has a soft spot for Jonathan. But that doesn't mean he's respecting God's will. And I think that's really your point, is that his attitude is, I hate David, but then he can get emotional. This is why some people talk about Saul as being perhaps bipolar, because of great swings in emotion, where he can break down when Saul can break down when Jonathan makes an appeal, and then the other hand he's trying to kill David with a spear. I don't know how to diagnose those things. I don't know how to diagnose bipolarism now, much less however many years ago, 3,000 years ago. Okay, who wants to? Yes, ma'am.
It's kind of interesting that Saul tried to send David out so he would die in battle, and then later on David does it to Uriah.
Right. David tries to kill Uriah the Hittite in battle so that he can have Bathsheba and nobody will suspect the child of being his. But then, of course, he repents, and Saul never does, and that's the difference between the two, right? Okay, so Saul's going to begin to pursue David in chapter 19, and if you want to read Psalm 59, I don't know that we'll take the time to do this, but you get some of David's reflections on Saul chasing him. And there are many psalms, in fact, where David is talking about how his enemies have caused him such hurt. And with many of those, what Saul is doing to him would fit. We don't know exactly what was on David's mind. David fought a lot of battles against a lot of people, so it's not as though we can always be specific, but Psalm 59 would apply. And here's the map that I gave you where he's fleeing. I had it on the screen, but since you couldn't see it very well, I thought I'd just give it to you on the paper. So Jonathan then is going to again appeal to Saul on David's behalf at the beginning of chapter 20, and then they are going to say farewell, apparently forever, because now Saul is so hardened that there's no going back. David's not going to be able to be in Saul's household peacefully anymore. Let's read the end of that chapter, 1 Samuel 20, verses 35 through 42. Now it came about in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field for the appointment with David, and a little lad was with him. And he said to his lad, "Run, find the arrows which I am about to shoot." As the lad was running, he shot an arrow past him. When the lad reached the place of the arrow which Jonathan had shot, Jonathan called after the lad and said, "Is not the arrow beyond you?" And that's the signal to David that he's, based upon their previous discussion, that David is not going to go back into the household of Saul. And Jonathan called after the lad, "Hurry, be quick, and do not stay." And Jonathan's lad picked up the arrow and came to his master. But the lad was not aware of anything. Only Jonathan and David knew about the matter. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to the lad and said to him, "Go and bring them to the city." When the lad was gone, David rose from the south side and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. And they kissed each other and wept together. But David wept no more. Jonathan said to David, "Go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever.'" Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. They were so close, but it was because of their father that they couldn't be together, and it's remarkable to me to think of what Jonathan might have done as a military leader under David's reign, and yet it just couldn't be because of Saul's bad attitude. Look at the way Saul continued to fall. Now, we noticed that Saul had committed those 2 or 3 sins last week, but then this week we see how he continues to decline. The negative spirit comes after the Spirit of the Lord departs. Then Saul has tried to kill David personally 3 times. He's put him in battle with the Philistines with the intention of getting him to die. He's given him Michal to David as a snare, but he apparently didn't realize how much Michal loved David. And then Saul has made it known to all the servants that he wants David dead. So I just want you to observe that one domino leads to another. And that's how it often is with sin, that we commit one sin and then it seems that we've got to do another sin, either to justify our first sin or to make our plan that we had with the first one to come out right. It's especially this way with lying. Once we start lying, it seems that we need to lie some more. And sometimes we feel that if we've done this one sin, then the next one is not that big of a deal. Whereas if you had started with Saul throwing a spear at David, that would have seemed out of the blue, unlikely, wouldn't have been plausible as something that Saul would choose to do. But you see him get progressively worse. And so we need to be careful that we do not slide into wrongdoing, or that we don't let our center shift to where we think of our typical behavior that would be upstanding before God as day goes by and we make one little compromise and another, that we begin to shift in one direction to where our normal is not where our normal used to be. And that's what happened with Saul. So we want to make sure that we stay committed to what we are obligated to do. Saul should have recognized his duty even as the king to respect God's anointed. I mean, think about it for a moment. If you want people to respect you as God's anointed, wouldn't you think you should respect David as God's anointed? But he just didn't see it that way. We should think the same way about other people. If we want them to respect us as being made in the image of God, as real people, not to be used as their ends, but to be ends in ourselves, then we should treat other people that way. That's just the golden rule, that if we think we're worth respect, then we should think other people are worth respect. But Saul didn't view things that way. Then Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him. We didn't talk about this in our overview, but in chapter 19, he also sent some messengers over there to try to figure out what he was doing, and he wanted eventually to capture David and bring him in. But remember that Michal had dressed up an idol in the bed to look like David. She had made it where they would think David was in the bed unless they really came in there and hunted for him. And that's interesting too, that Michal even had an idol. That just shows Saul's job as a father had not been probably what it should have been, that his children are worshiping idols. And you can imagine what it would have been like to grow up in the household of Saul with some of the attitudes that he had. But we don't see a specific example of idolatry in Saul's household, but we do in the lives of his children. So that's a sad thing. And then we've talked about his attempts to kill David, but we haven't mentioned his attempt to kill Jonathan. When Jonathan goes and tries to intercede for David, Saul tries to kill him too, kill his own son. That shows how much he hated David. It wasn't so much that he hated Jonathan, but he hated David enough to kill Jonathan if he was on David's side. So it's really a bitter hatred. Let's talk about a few practical lessons in the last few minutes that we have. Let's see, which one would we like to talk about? We can contribute something to the fight like Jesse did, even if we're not on the front lines. Jesse sent some food. He sent some bread and some roasted grain and some cheese with David to go and try to encourage his sons in the battle, but he sent something even more important than that, didn't he? And that was his own son who would actually win the battle. Now let's think about what we might contribute to the work of the Lord. We might contribute much greater things than we imagine. We may do so much good with our little abilities and with our little opportunities. But of course, the main thing we contribute to the work of the Lord if we're parents is the holiness of our children, because they can do so much for the Lord that we'll never be able to do. But we need not think that just because we don't have some particular role of prominence, or just because we don't have the opportunity to give as much money as somebody else does, that we cannot work for the Lord and accomplish great things for Him. Jesse did more, in a sense, on that day for Israel's victory than anybody else did, because he sent his son into the battle, who was faithful. And then somebody mentioned God's providence. I was going to mention that God is looking out for David through all of this, and that we're always on the Lord's side, on the winning side if we're on the Lord's side, because in 1 Samuel 17, even though the Israelites seemed to be overpowered by the Philistines, it only took God plus one person in order to win the battle. And so we shouldn't think of ourselves as being overpowered by the devil if God is on our side. And then we might notice that we cannot avert our attention from the Lord's mission. And I bring that up because Saul is so preoccupied with David, beginning in chapter 17, that we don't read anything about Saul doing the good of the Israelite kingdom after that, at least not for a long time. He does go into battle later. But notice that from the time he becomes obsessed with David, it's basically that he's just sitting around trying to figure out how to kill this one person. Is that the way his reign should have been going? Is that the job of the king? Try to figure out how to kill one innocent Israelite? No, it should be precisely the opposite, that he protects the innocent people by trying to do what's in service to the people as a whole. But he got his priorities mixed up. And right, he's only thinking about himself. And then it is sinful for people to crouch in fear of the enemies of God. Jesus tells his disciples over and over again to not be fearful, but to be courageous. Joshua was told to be courageous in the beginning of the conquest, that he should not be afraid. And it's always a temptation to have ungodly fear. But God says that we must be courageous in the face of whatever comes in this life. Let's turn over to the book of Acts and look at Acts chapter 27. And this may be a good place for us to finish our study for tonight due to time. But here's what Paul is saying to the guys who were on the shipwreck with him as they were on their way to Rome, where Paul's going to be tried. They had gone a long time without food, verse 21 says. Then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island.'" Notice what Paul says here. He says, you should have courage because of God's revealed plan, which is going to be accomplished. And David goes into this battle thinking God's will is going to be accomplished. I'm going to be the king. I've been anointed. And so God's not going to let me fall to this giant Goliath. So I'm going to go into the battle with confidence. That's the amazing thing about David, is how calm he seems when he goes to fight Goliath. There's no shaking in his boots. There's no fear about it. He just goes in and does it. As a matter of fact, just as almost as though he was doing his everyday job. He's just going to go beat this giant. Well, that's because he believed in God's revelation. And that should be the attitude of every Christian, where we say, God has said what's going to happen to me in my life. He's given me his plan. I'm going to follow his plan. And what's going to happen to me is what God wants to. And whatever that is on this earth, it means I'm going to go home to glory with him after I die. So that gives the Christian a calm repose about life that's unavailable to people who are lost in the world. Okay, anybody want to have a closing comment along those lines or any other lines? Somebody want to have the last word? Okay, well, thank you very much, and we'll keep talking about David fleeing from Saul next week.